Climate change has been at the forefront of debate from as early as the 1960s. Currently, the world has hit a critical point, and we can see this from the massive explosion of media coverage that has also led to an increase in scientific research, school discussions, and government forum. This threat is greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide, and this will lead to the rise in temperatures, making the planet pretty much unlivable for humans and other living things. And because of this relationship, we're going to be looking at the climate strategies and policies in place for Australia's major states and territories, and then comparing these to see if we can find a relationship between these two. Okay, so let's start with the Australian Capital Territory. Currently, they have a renewable energy target of 100% by the year 2020, and these three that you'll see on the screen are what I saw as the main legislations that I found that have been enacted so far into their government, with their strategy coming out in 2007 and then their official act for climate change coming out in 2010. Okay, so we took the carbon emissions and the yearly temperatures, the means, between 2007 to 2017, and then plotted that into two separate scatter plots. So one for the carbon emissions and one for the temperature. As we can see from the carbon emissions, they're kind of fluctuated and there isn't really any pattern. This could be due to the fact that ACT might not have had a very steady support for their climate change strategies and policies over the 10-year period. So we then compared these two to each other, and we came up with an R value by squaring the R2 value of 0.6038, which sort of indicates that there is a moderate negative linear relationship. But if we look at the line of regression, we can see that it doesn't actually seem to fit these points very well. And again, these varying points could be due to the fact that the state may not have had steady support with their climate change strategies and policies, even though they have been in place since the beginning of the time period at 2007. So now we'll move on to New South Wales. The state is kind of lagging behind the rest in terms of climate change strategies and policies, in the fact that they've only just sort of released a framework for a strategy, and they don't actually have any other legislations in play at the moment, or even a renewable energy target. The thing going for this state is probably that they've got a fund set up, ready for those projects, but other than that, there's not much in terms of actually tackling the issues of climate change. We then collected the carbon emissions and the temperatures for New South Wales and plotted these into a year-by-year scatter plot for each, and found that despite the state having no strong climate change policies or strategies, that the carbon emissions did slowly sort of decline over that 10-year period, whereas the temperature sort of separated into two clusters. We then compared these two to each other, and square rooting the R2 value, we got a R value of 0.827, which indicated a strong negative relationship. This could be due to the fact that the state does have the highest population out of all of Australia's major states and territories, and that is why we're seeing this sort of unregulated carbon emissions relationship between the temperature. We'll now take a look at the Northern Territory, and if we thought that New South Wales was behind, well, Northern Territory beats them. They're the second most furthest behind in climate change, with only recently sort of having discussions of a climate change strategy in 2017. They do have a Geothermal Energy Act as well as an Aboriginal carbon industry strategy. This carbon industry strategy is the idea of having Aboriginal landowners and rangers actually backburn a lot of the dead tree foliage in the cooler seasons, so in that way when the warmer seasons come along, the wildfires that are very prevalent in this territory are not so extreme, as this is where most of this territory's carbon emissions come from. Looking at Northern Territory's carbon emissions and temperature by year, we can see that they sort of jump up and down throughout the 10-year period, and the same goes for the temperature by year as well. This could again be due to not having any climate change strategies or policies in place, as well as the state's prevalence for wildfires in the hotter season. We then compared these two, and we got an R value of 0.2464, which indicates that there is actually no linear relationship between carbon emissions and temperature for the Northern Territory. And we can see this with our sort of line of regression here, where it struggles to sort of cater for a lot of these points on this comparison scatter plot. Jumping over to Queensland now, we see that they have a renewable energy target of 50% by the year 2030, but have only just sort of released a climate adaptation strategy and a transition strategy in the year 2017. Before then, they've had the Greenhouse Gas Storage Act of 2009, where they were looking into ways of storing carbon gas in underground geological formations, usually formations that have been formed from previous mining. They don't seem to have any strong strategies or policies in place at the moment, but they do have plans for the future for solar and wind farms. So if we take a look at the carbon emissions by year and the temperature by year for Queensland, we can see a steady decline in their carbon emissions with a slight upward peak at 2014. And for their temperature, they've got a slight increase or steady increase from 2010, sort of curving upwards here. It's important to note that around 2010, Queensland did suffer from some severe flooding, which could explain why their temperature has dropped here, considering that they received quite a lot of rainfall in that time. We then compared the two, and we got a R value of 0.3766, which shows that it has a weak negative linear relationship. And if we look at the points along the linear line regression, we can also see that it doesn't seem to fit any of these data points very well, which is kind of similar to New South Wales, and again could be due to the fact that they don't really have any strong climate change strategies or policies in place. Now on to South Australia. They are currently leading in terms of combating climate change compared to the rest of Australia's states and territories, and have had more than a decade of consistent policy support for renewable energy. They managed to switch 99% of their state's reliance on fossil fuels to 47% of that being renewable electricity generation, predominantly wind and solar power in 2016. They currently have the Sustainable City Incentive Scheme for the City of Adelaide, and the Climate Change and Greenhouse Emissions Reduction Act, which was put in play in 2007. And the renewable energy target has been 50%. Having a look at South Australia's carbon emissions and temperature by year, we can see that steady support of climate change strategies and policies has led into a steady decline of carbon emissions in the 10-year period. The temperatures seem to have been very sporadic, and we found that a lot of the southerly states seem to have the same kind of variable fluctuations within the 10-year period. We then compared these two, and we got an R value of 0.4011, which sort of just tells us that we have a weak positive relationship between carbon emissions and temperature. On the upside though, we can see that the lower carbon emissions do generally seem to have the lower temperatures as well. This could be because of the fluctuating temperatures for the state overall. Heading down to Tasmania now. So this state has actually managed to make some pretty amazing feats when it comes to climate change. They have managed to switch 92% of their energy source to hydroelectric power, and we're also one of the only Australian states and territories to achieve a zero net emissions in the year 2015. This was due to some of the policies that they have in place, which is to increase their carbon storage capacity as well as maintain this carbon storage capacity in the forests around them and also on individuals' farms. So we can see by Tasmania's carbon emissions by year scatterplot just how well their policies have affected the decrease in carbon emissions over the 10-year period. We can see the drop in 2015 where they managed to achieve zero net emissions, retaining 487 gigagrams of carbon than they actually gave out. The slight increase here was due to the fact that there was the Baselink interconnector that connects the electricity grids of both Tasmania and Victoria was damaged, and the state had to go back and rely on gas for that period of time. We then compared the two together, and we can see that the data has broken up into two clusters. On your left hand side, we've got the extremely low levels that the state has managed to achieve, as well as our zero net emissions just here on the far left hand side of the y-axis. Whilst on the other side, we can see the group of larger carbon emissions that was between the years 2007 to 2010. We looked at the R value and we found that there was a moderate negative relationship between these two. And it is very noticeable how these policies have managed to divide the so Victoria actually has quite a few policies in place at the moment, with a renewable energy target of 100% by the year 2022. They also have the Baselink interconnector, which was commissioned in 2006, whereby connecting the electricity grids of both Tasmania and Victoria to sort of cover the state's electrical needs in case of drought. And this interconnector has also allowed Victoria to take some of its reliance on coal energy and use some of Tasmania's hydroelectric power instead. So Victoria's carbon emissions actually looks pretty similar to that of Tasmania, which we just saw. And this huge gap between 2012 to 2013 can actually be explained by the fact that Tasmania was supplying Victoria with high amounts of hydropower between these times, which was also one of the reasons that led to the damage in the Baselink interconnector in 2015 or in the late 2015. As we can see with Victoria's temperatures, again, just like South Australia and some of the other southerly states, they have been very sporadic over the last 10 years. We compared these two and we found the R value to be 0.3886, and this tells us that there is no linear relationship between carbon emissions and temperature. Similarly, if we look at the scatter plot here, Victoria has almost broken up into two separate clusters, just like Tasmania, except for this little outlier here, which was actually from the year 2008. But again, a lot of the lower carbon emissions have bunched together and the higher have bunched together. Unlike Tasmania though, we can't seem to see any change in temperature for these levels. In fact, the higher levels of carbon emissions seems to have the lower temperatures for the state of Victoria. Last but not least, we've got Western Australia. This state is by far the furthest behind all of Australia's major states and territories in terms of climate change. They have no policies, no strategies, and no renewable energy targets. In fact, they've only just sort of released the framework for a policy in August 2019, hoping to expect this released in the year 2020. They are also a state that's known for its sort of boom in mining industry, and we can see the effects of this in the carbon emissions scatter plot. With the rise of CO2 emissions from about 2011 and onwards, as for the temperature, it's kind of like a mirror image here, where the temperature has seemed to have risen up until about 2011, and then sort of drifted off and fluctuated for the remainder of the 10-year period. We then compared the two, and we found the R value to be 0.19, showing that there is no linear relationship between carbon emissions and temperature. Since the state has no climate change strategies or policies in place, it's also kind of represented in the linear line here, where none of the points are really matching, and it is almost a straight line for both the carbon emissions and for the temperature. Overall, we found that each state and territory manages to vary in both carbon emissions and temperature, and this could be related to the fact that there are different kinds of climate strategies and policies in place for each of these places, as well as the geographical location, which in turn affects the state's different variability in weather patterns. And as we had seen, the southerly states tend to have a lot more fluctuations than the more warmer and tropical areas of Australia. Surprisingly, New South Wales did have one of the strongest linear relationships out of all the states, which could be due to their unregulated overall emissions, and because they are the largest state by population in all of Australia, whilst Tasmania has really moved forward in terms of their climate change actions. And yeah, thank you, and